another installment of Chupacabra Games Monday Night Modern. Your host, James Farina, channel. Believe he is. Saw Blood Moon, and that is not the most common main deck card, but we do see it here, and it's doing some work. Although Will, I believe, was on the play. Yeah, so he did have a chance to get some basics out. Might have known what Caleb was up to fetch for some basics. Uh, Getting basics, of course, is also going to be beneficial for the Quaddle. See if Will's an abundant growth. It's just a traverse. Okay. Will switching things up here. I believe he was on Eldamri's call in the past. Now I saw a counterspell in his deck now too, so he's playing less Risen Reefs, more counterspells, trying to do the Delirium thing, which means it'll give him a better chance at casting Emrakul as well. Ooh, very lucky, naturally had the basic in hand. This will be 3 mana for a Teferi. We can see that here. And there is the Reveler of Time. Looks like he's just going to tick up and pass. Uh, he could have picked up the Blood Moon. I think he'd rather wait a turn to do that. This does leave Teferi vulnerable to Prismatic Ending, which we see now. And I think the best play to make there is to pick up the Icewing Coatl, just to ensure that you get a lot of value out of your Teferi, as well as the 1-for-1 exchange with the Prismatic Ending. This way, you kind of just do the 1-for-1 trade and don't get much value, but you are forcing Caleb to have the Prismatic Ending. And I think it's fairly likely that he could have that or Leyline Binding, but maybe Binding isn't as popular in this build because of the Blood Moon. We still find a way to cast Omnath here, and playing a Mountain will still gain us 4 life and attack for 1 with the Coatl. So I guess with this line, you wouldn't be casting the Coatl for a few turns. Maybe you value damage there off of the Teferi. Making Caleb deal with the Blood Moon is also an interesting choice to just be able to bounce it, give them the option to replay it or do something else that turn. So like iteration is going to reveal another Blood Moon and the cat as well. So not quite Saheeli Rhyme cat combo shenanigans just yet, but one piece of the combo is still decent enough. It is fairly fairly easy to get rid of on its own when it's not backed up by the Planeswalker or any Ephemerites or something like that. But we'll see how far Caleb can take it with the Infinite Cat combo. Caleb's just going to pick up a Fable off of that after Furying the Omnath, and here's a second one. Back up Omnath to draw a card, as well as gain some more life. But since we still have Blood Moon in play, the fetch lands are not going to work, buying Caleb a little bit of time here. Caleb getting to 1-tap with the Goblin Shaman, going to be able to make a treasure here. And he will be able to discard if he so chooses. He drew a Chalice of the Void. I think I'd like to keep that, put it on 1, just mitigate the outs that Will could have here. But if he keeps playing big elementals, this game is just going to be harder for Caleb. Although I'm pretty sure he's playing things like Fury, Solitude. We saw Prismatic Ending, potentially Leyline Binding to be able to answer Omnath. So I think we're pretty well equipped there. All right, we've returned just answering a judge call from one of the other tables. And it looks like what we've missed as Caleb has put the chalice on one, flipped over his Fable into a reflection, and Will has continued to press on damage, as well as we just cast an Ice Bank Coatl. So Blood Moon making things a little tricky for Will here. Not giving him as many options as he would probably like, not being able to hard cast Solitude, um, making it awkward to cast something like Ren and Icewind Coatl, or Teferi and Icewind Coatl, since there's only one island in play. But if we ever do remove this Blood Moon, Will's going to be able to fully trigger Omnath and probably swing in for lethal. I think we see Solitude for Caleb here. Does he have a white card to pitch for it? Caleb will just pass the turn back to Will, who will untap. Here is 9 mana for Emrakul the Promised End. That is castable through Blood Moon and definitely a reason to main deck the card. We are going to see a Solitude before we untap, though. Caleb's done a 2. We'll come across for 2. Oh, making a copy of it, I see, with reflections. Okay. We're going to be able to kill the Omnath. As well as have a hasty lifelinker, so he's not the Icewind Coatl. I think Caleb's still in this game. Like we were taking Caleb, which Fury for turn. To Caleb's Teferi for. He could bounce his own creature that would let Caleb draw one more card. So we may not want to do that, but we are ticking down to 1 here. Going to be bouncing something. Bouncing Blood Moon, okay. That'll draw him a Flooded Strand. And now that the Blood Moon is in play, you can play the Flooded Strand, sack both of the fetches, fail to find, or shock once, and that would actually be lethal. And it looks like Will is explaining the situation to him. Players confirming what life totals are. And Caleb will shock down to 0. All right. Emrakul's triggered ability going to be going the distance, dealing 4 damage, which in this case is good enough. All right. So players are in between the sideboards now. We can take a moment to think about what they could be bringing in. I think Will's in an interesting position as he's not entirely sure what his list, what Caleb's list entails, is what I would imagine. Uh, I think something like Mystical Dispute, if Will has it in his board, is worth bringing in. Whereas Veil of Summer might not be, as Caleb does play Teferi, as we saw, and bringing in Veil against a Teferi deck, but not a counterspell deck, is not the greatest option. It's certainly a play if there are relevant targets against like maybe a black deck like Yawgmoth or the black red scam deck, as people are calling that. Um, and I think there's some reasons to bring in Veil if you expect some sideboarded counterspells. But banking on the fact of chance, I don't really like it, especially since if there are counterspells just coming in from the board, it's really only going to be one or two mystical disputes, maybe three or four, uh, something like Teamer Rhinos. But that's a matchup where I would actually want Veil since they already have main deck counterspells that we know about. I think Caleb's deck is more combo focused, and we're just trying to do one thing pretty well and protect it with Teferis. So I think Will is less incentivized to keep in counter spells, maybe fear of the Teferis, but keeping in the four main deck ones is probably fine. He has some really powerful cards springing from the sideboard that I'm just thinking of, which is entirely possible. It's like our players are starting game number two of round one here, and we have Caleb on the play, who is fetching up a Rodburn Triumph, step it looks like, and Will just has a Windswept Heath in play. So very early turns still. We're just building our boards, and we will continue do so until someone makes the first play. Really, how it's going to be. Just whoever decides to jump the gun first, try to resolve it to Fairy or Red and Six. Caleb is not playing Red and Six, he's just a three-color deck, so no shenanigans quite like that. We'll probably see a Teferi if he has one here. Just try to force Will to have the counter spell as well as fetch not around Blood Moon, but rather to be able to cast his spells, which is what Caleb's hoping for if he left in his Blood Moons. It's also entirely possible that the Blood Moons might have been pushed out, but I think on the draws when you don't want that, I think on the play most matchups, it's pretty, and it's going to make Will play around it even if it isn't there, which is my thinking boarding it out. But looking like he's just going to pick up Kahira here, which if you're Will, that's a very good sight to see. There might not be a lot of gas going on for Caleb here, at least on turn three, and that is an ode to Will that he might not be playing any counter spells in Caleb's deck. Will have a third land here. He's going to chalk in a Steam Vents. Might make it a little more reasonable to fetch up a basic island to be able to cast a counterspell if he has one. And Will is just going to do that, fetch up the island here. And in response to this Teferi Time Reveler, we may see a counter spell, and Caleb does have a blue up with Mystical Dispute. So this Teferi is going to resolve one way or another. And I think we're just going to see it tick up to 5. It's really only bad against a Leyline Binding or Prismatic Ending, but there's nothing to bounce, so just picking up one card here leaves it vulnerable to Ren and 6, Bolt, Unholy Heat, more things than it would if you just ticked it up to 5. So I think 5 is fine here. It may make it a little awkward for Will to fetch. He's probably looking for a 4th land here, would be my guess. These decks sometimes struggle to hit land drops 4 through 6 if you don't have Ren and 6. But Will finding a Misty Rainforest here is going to be doing some fetching, it looks like. And we do see a Leyline Binding to take out this Teferi at sorcery speed. Pass it back to Caleb. And we'll untap with 4 lands in play. We could have a Leyline Binding of our own to actually take out this Teferi. Or to free this Teferi and then be able to bounce our own. Caleb is just going to find a basic plains, so we may see a Blood Moon incoming if Caleb is prepared to play through one himself, but at the moment, looks a little rough. We're just going to try to jam a Saheeli Ra into play. Which I think is good enough. Yeah, that's going to resolve. Tick up to 4, deal 1 damage to Will, and give Caleb a Scry. Now, the main reason for playing Saheeli in this day and age is for her -2 ability, being able to make a copy of an artifact or creature. It becomes an artifact, and it gains haste. So what that's going to allow Caleb to do is to be able to copy Felidar Guardian, which, if you don't know, flickers a non-land permanent and brings it back. So being able to reset Saheeli effectively, making another cat, will allow you to repeat that process indefinitely and make an infinitely large number of cats with haste that can attack your opponent. So Will has a Omnath, Locus of Creation, to drop down here for us on turn 5. No fetch lands, just going to be gaining 4 life here, but the 4/4 Jelly Bean might be good enough if Caleb doesn't have an answer relatively soon. Going to get a Scry. Ping Will down to 17, it should be, I believe. And here's a Felidar Guardian. Will doesn't have a Solitude. We're going to pick things up and go over to game 3 with Will on the play. Saheeli Cat combo is still proving pretty powerful. I think the 4-color decks can definitely struggle against a combo deck. And what really sealed that deal was Caleb having the Mystical Dispute or the counterspell, making Will utilize his resources like the Leyline Binding Fairy, which he quite literally had to. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to cast it at the opportune time to take out the Felidar Guardian. All right, looks like our players are all shuffled up and ready to go for game number 3 here. This will be Will on the play, which I think gives him a pretty significant advantage. So long as he can answer a Teferi, he will be able to answer the cat combo if that's what Caleb's going for. I think on the draw, Caleb is more incentivized to go for like a value sort of Blood Moon plan here. I think going for the combo can be fairly risky. Just baiting out Will's removal and interaction on the Teferi is probably good enough. Like we saw in game 2, where uh, just Teferi being an all-star that game, making Will use his cards and advantage on the Teferi. And it didn't really matter too much what Will played outside of that in terms of defensive options like Omnath. Gaining life is just not going to cut it against Caleb making infinite 1/4s. It looks like both of our players going down to 6 here. Now take a look at these. Looks like Caleb's got a couple Solitudes, 2 to 3 lands, and the namesake card Teferi Time Raveler. So I think we're going to bottom one of these lands, it looks like, and hope to draw another one so we can cast the Teferi on time. We'll starting us off with a Wooded Foothills, presumably getting an Abundant Growth that will draw my card and pass the turn back to Caleb. You see just that, and the Abundant Growth will draw Will a card and pass things back to Caleb. Just be a Misty Rainforest pass back. Now, knowing that Caleb has Blood Moons, it is possible that Will maybe should be holding on to the Abundant Growth and just fetching up a basic forest there. Whereas this turn, being able to put an Abundant Growth on a fetch land may prove a little more useful. But Will is on the play, and I think that is a big factor in this, that it'll give him a lot more time to actually um, but put basics into play to play around this Blood Moon. But we may just see a Triumph here, depending on the contents of Will's hand. Yeah, so we are going to just get the Ragran Triumph. Untap and maybe try to resolve a Teferi here, but into 2 blue does not seem like the greatest option, but not necessarily the worst either. In case of making your opponent happy. Alright, Iteration is just going to find another fetch land. It's perfectly fine for now. There's not too much pressure being added to the board, and we'll be able to assemble our army of basic lands here to play through any Blood Moons that Caleb may have. So Teferi has entered the battlefield, and we'll be ticking down, drawing a card, just passing things back to Will, looks like. Will assembling all of his basics, so have plenty of mana to be able to cast his spells under a Blood Moon, even another abundant. That's what comes off the top. We will just have to wait and see. 3 mana could be Prismatic Ending. No, Fairy of his own. So we're playing strictly at sorcery speed here. Picking up the Abundant Growth, but tapping the other Triome might have been a little bit better here. But we have an Unholy Heat to take out Caleb's Teferi. I'm assuming that was the draw for turn, or draw off the Will's Teferi. So it didn't work out either way. It was drawn up, having the Unholy Heat or the Abundant Growth be able to cast. But Caleb does have a backup Teferi here. We're going to go down to 1 as well. Okay, so leaving us vulnerable to burn spells. We're going to put Abundant Growth on a basic already. I don't hate that. Plains is a little awkward to play with. We're just going to cast a Bauble. Okay, so Will is fully on the Delirium build here. Mishra's Baubles and all. Here is the Planeswalker combo of Red and 6 and Teferi. Definitely something that would have played around a little differently, I think, if I were Caleb. Picking the second Teferi up to 5 may have been beneficial. Honestly, on both of them, as I don't believe Will had Delirium at the time. And yeah, he just now has it. So off of the Bauble. So having a Teferi at 5 wouldn't have died to a Ren. But that means the first, I think taking down the first one is fine, but the second one is pretty risky, as having Ren or Unholy Heats, Fury, multitude of things that Will could have just to react to this Teferi. And Teferi is the integral piece of your combo, honestly. It makes a lot of Will's cards dead, so. We're going to cast Fire, targeting one of these planeswalkers. Will seems like he has a response, but he's just going to let it resolve with the Flusterstorm, as it would tap Caleb out but not counter the spell. And Prismatic Ending is going to take care of this Ren. We may see the Fluster come down now. Yeah, I like keeping the Ren around a little bit longer. And Fluster's not really going to counter many of Caleb's spells after this in terms of his combo pieces. Ren's going to go up to 3. Pick up a Flooded Strand. I think we're just going to fetch immediately. No, he's just going to add it to hand. Okay. And it'll be a Traverse with Delirium enabled. Finding us an Omnath, casting it, drawing a card, and playing the Flooded Strand that we know about. Generate a bunch of mana here, giving Will the opportunity to buy Yorion if he so wishes, holding up a counter spell if he can fetch an island here. All right, yeah, we are just going to fetch up a Temple Garden, shock and buy Yorion. So we may be holding up something like Ephemerate, or Leyline Binding is only 1 mana right now. So I think the best thing that Caleb could have here is just a Teferi Time Raveler. Looks like it's going to be a hard cast Solitude, targeting Omnath. Going to gain will 4 more life. Back up to. And that's just going to be a pass back for Caleb. Taking advantage of the fact that his opponent was tapped out relatively and making use of his spell while he can. Picking up the Flooded Strand yet again. Looks like we are casting a Yorion here. Going to come down and flicker our Abundant Growth and our Ren. Mildly questionable on flickering the Ren. That is going to reduce Ren's loyalty. We are going to draw a card off of the Abundant Growth, moving on to the fetch, so we could put an enchantment in the graveyard to be able to make the Promised End Emrakul cost a little bit less. Five more mana. It's going to be a second Solitude for Caleb. Now, if Will doesn't have any action here, we are going to get a 2-for-1 in a sense, as we're going to be able to take out the Ren and 6 here. See if Will has any Unholy Heats or anything lying around. And it's going to be a Leyline Binding on the Solitude itself, okay? So really valuing the Ren and 6 here. Ensuring us our land drops. Maybe one of Will's last cards is the Emrakul already. So I think with a land drop, Will is able to cast the Emrakul if he has it in his hand already. So Will I get a good look at his deck here. We see Dress Downs in the main board, or in his deck at this point. I believe there would be main board if we were on the Delirium version. Will take a draw. Take up his Ren and 6. Yeah, I think we do have an Emrakul situation here. As we are counting our card types out. Yep. Making Emrakul cost 7 mana. Which Will has 7 in play already. Gonna be Abundant Growth again onto the Flooded Strand. Netting us another card. And casting us an Emrakul. So it's not uncounterable, but Caleb only has the 1 mana up right now. And looks like we're going to go straight to Caleb's turn here. Now, getting rid of the Supreme Verdict is going to be interesting. We don't have a Solitude to pitch it for, but we are going to cast Expressive Iteration, okay? Felidar Guardian, Mystical Dispute, and Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Putting the Dispute in the hand of the Felidar Guardian in exile, we presumably will not cast. We could cast Teferi, and then promptly counter it with the Dispute. And then Caleb is left with a Supreme Verdict, which is better than nothing. It is a way to answer the Emrakul. It might not be a Solitude, but it is probably better here in this case, as it's not going to gain Will 13 life. But it will send it to the graveyard, which means it could be Eternal Witnessed in the future. So we're going to start by attacking with the Solitude into the Emrakul. And we will counter the Teferi with the Mystical Dispute, pass it back to Caleb. It's like Fire Ice and Supreme Verdict in hand for Caleb now. We're going to use that Verdict to take care of the promised end. And buy Kahira. Pass it back. Saw Solitude for Will, but not another Omnath or anything just yet. I'd be adding back our Flooded Strand, or Windswept Heath this time. Will fanning out his graveyard may have something like Eternal Witness here. Let's see what he has going on exactly. I know with the Traverse of the Uvenwald builds, there is some room for one-ofs, so might be possible. It's just going to be a Kahira and a pass back for Caleb. Prismatic Ending to take care of the cat. And do we have anything to follow up with that? I'm just ticking Ren and 6 up to 6. One away from alting, which is pretty powerful and basically going to lock Caleb out of the game for the rest of it. It's going to be Prismatic Vista for Caleb here and just passing back. So Will has all of the power in the world right now, being able to ultimate this Ren next turn, so long as it survives at its current loyalty. Will giving himself access to more mana by putting the Abundant Growths on fetches. It's going to be a Fire Ice targeting Red and 6, a pretty powerful play, buys Caleb a couple more turns here. I think Fury is the play here too. So if this resolves, it's going to put Ren down to 1. Yep, all right. And here's a Solitude to take care of the Fury, putting Caleb up to 22. Fable the Mirrorbreaker is the draw for Caleb this turn. And to get some gas going here, being able to block profitably against the Solitude. And here is a Felidar Guardian that's going to be met by a Dress Down. So we're not going to be flickering the Fable here, which is actually a pretty cool interaction, being able to make more Goblin Shamans as well as just resetting the Fable. Even if it is already flipped, it'll send it back to the front side, oddly enough. We're going to be trading here to keep Ren alive. So since Emrakul has already been dealt with, we're going to have to find another way to win this game. Will's looking for a Traverse or Omnath desperately. This is going to flip over the Fable of the Mirrorbreaker over to Reflections. And honestly, if we find a Saheeli here and Will doesn't have a counterspell, he already used a Dress Down. This is going to send Ren down to 3. So Felidar Guardian's going to at least keep Ren in check. We'll be able to start making copies of Felidar Guardians. But we need a second Fable if we wanted to make a lot of value. Yuri's going to be met by a counterspell, so Will hopefully having more than just that one counterspell in hand. I can't get a great look at his hand, so we're not sure many cards he's sitting on right now. And we could try to take out the Ren here, which I like, but choosing to not expose the Fable to something like an Endurance or Ice Fang Quaddle, which is pretty good restraint, but I think Will would have blocked the Felder Guardian at this point if he had one. He could have Endurance, though. Omnath is going to be met by a Dress Down. Okay. So instead, Caleb will draw a card. And here is the Omnath we were talking about. This is going to be one that needs to be answered by Caleb via a Fury or Solitude, but he has used quite a few of those already. Something like Prismatic Ending is not going to do the job just now because we can't get 4 colors of mana just yet, as I believe Caleb is only capable of making 3. May have an off-color Triumph. We'll just have to wait and see. I believe we were still on Will's end step, so we're gaining life, making some mana, and potentially dealing damage to Caleb as well. And so that is time and round for our players. They will begin their 5 extra turns to determine the victor of this match. Here's a second failable for Caleb. And Holy Heat's going to take out the Felidar Guardian, but it's going to be met by an Ephemerate. Ephemerate will be going on a rebound if it resolves. I think we're still thinking about it on the stack here. Caleb's going to get to untap here. Ephemerate in the graveyard, not on rebound, so we're not going to be exiling any of these. There's another Fury. It could be the 3rd or 4th one we've seen so far. They've all been very good, demanding an answer immediately. We're going to be sending a Fury. So copying a Fury, ETB kill Ren, attack for 6. Fable really shining in these later turns, giving Caleb a lot of potential to interact as well as deal quick amounts of damage. And we will now be able to make copies of Reflections, but not profit off of them as this is the last turn for Caleb. Will's at 25. I think we can deal 20 damage here, but that's not quite enough to be able to kill Will, as well as any interaction would be able to stop this. It's a third Fable for Caleb here. Omnath from Will. And he's showing us a handful of lands on a Flusterstorm. So I'm undetermined how this matchup is actually going to be played out, as this was the final turn. Technically, it could have been a draw, but we may see to the other one momentarily if the score gets updated here. But from my eyes, it did look like a draw, so we'll see. We will see everyone back here for round number 2 in just a few moments.